The Zephyrian Council chamber stretched across 3 kilometers of polished obsidian, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into artificial starlight. Ambassador Kethavar stood at the center of the circular platform, his forearms spread wide in the traditional gesture of dominance. Around him, representatives from 17 different species maintained their carefully measured distances, each positioning themselves according to the ancient protocols of galactic hierarchy. "The matter is settled," Kethavar announced, his voice carrying the harmonic undertones that made his species natural leaders. "The Terran petition for membership in the Galactic Coalition has been reviewed and found inadequate." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembly. The crystalline hive minds chimed their approval in perfect synchronization. The gaseous nebulari pulsed with satisfied bioluminescence. Even the normally stoic Ironborn delegates nodded their metallic heads in unison. "Their military capabilities are laughable," continued High General Voxthul of the Crimson Legion, his scarred carapace gleaming under the chamber lights. "Single-planet civilization, primitive kinetic weapons, no energy shields, no quantum manipulation technology. They would be nothing more than a liability in our conflicts against the Void Reapers. Their psychological profiles are equally concerning," added Dr. Silandra, the Coalition's chief xenobiologist. Her tentacles writhed as she accessed the holographic data streams. "Emotional instability, irrational decision-making under pressure. They experience something they call fear, which appears to compromise their combat effectiveness entirely." The assembled delegates shared what passed for laughter among their various species. Fear was a concept so primitive, so utterly alien to the advanced civilizations of the galaxy, that its very existence seemed almost quaint. The Zephyrians had evolved beyond such base emotions millions of years ago. The Ironborn had been built without fear subroutines. The crystalline hive minds operated on pure logic matrices that had no room for such inefficiencies. "Perhaps," suggested Trade Minister Kelnoth, "we should consider them for protectorate status instead. Their planet does possess some interesting mineral deposits." "Absolutely not." Kethavar's response was immediate and firm. "The humans have already demonstrated their instability. Their own historical records show countless wars fought over trivial resources and ideological differences. They are clearly incapable of civilized cooperation." The vote was unanimous, as expected. 17 species, each representing billions of evolved souls, agreeing that humanity was simply too primitive, too flawed, too fear-ridden to join the galactic community. Ambassador Kethavar was sealing the official rejection documents when his aide, a young Zephyrian named Talmar, approached with obvious urgency. "Sir," Talmar whispered, "there's been an incident at the observation deck." Kethavar's primary eyes narrowed while his secondary pair continued monitoring the chamber. "What kind of incident?" "The human delegate, he's requested to address the council." A ripple of surprise passed through the chamber. The human representative had been relegated to the observation gallery, a polite way of allowing them to witness their rejection without actually participating in the proceedings. For them to request speaking privileges now was either breathtakingly arrogant or completely ignorant of protocol. "Absolutely not," Kethavar said. "The matter is closed. Have security escort him." "Sir," Talmar interrupted, "something that would normally result in severe disciplinary action. He's not moving." Security tried to approach him, but what? They stopped. All of them. Even the Ironborn guards won't go near him. Kethavar felt something he hadn't experienced in centuries: uncertainty. The Ironborn were fearless by design, their emotional inhibitors making them perfect peacekeepers. For them to hesitate suggested something unprecedented was occurring. "What exactly is this human doing?" "Nothing, sir. He's just standing there, looking at them." The chamber had grown quiet now, with delegates beginning to notice the disturbance. Through the transparent aluminum barriers that separated the main floor from the observation deck, they could see a lone figure silhouetted against the starfield beyond. The human was unremarkable by galactic standards. Bipedal, carbon-based, roughly 2 meters tall. He wore simple dark clothing with no technological enhancements visible. No weapons, no armor, no apparent augmentations of any kind. By all logical measures, he should have been the least threatening individual in the entire facility. Yet something was wrong. Kethavar activated his long-range visual sensors and focused on the human's face, What he saw there made his throat sacs contract involuntarily. The human's eyes, those primitive optical organs, held something that the ambassador's advanced mind struggled to categorize. It wasn't anger, though there was controlled fury in the set of his jaw. It wasn't aggression, though his stance suggested coiled readiness. It was something deeper, something that seemed to bypass all logical thought processes and trigger responses in brain centers that Kethvar had thought long dormant. Open a communication channel, he found himself saying. Sir? Tolimar looked confused. I said open a channel to the human. The holographic interface materialized, showing the human delegate in full resolution. Captain James McKinnon, according to his credentials, former military according to his file, nothing special about his service record, just another soldier from a primitive world. But when those eyes locked onto Kethvar's through the holographic display, the Zephyrian ambassador felt something he had never experienced before, something that his species had evolved beyond, that his mind insisted was impossible. He felt afraid, not the rational caution that guided tactical decisions, or the healthy respect for superior technology. This was something primal, something that reached back through millions of years of evolution to when his ancestors had been prey animals on the wild plains of Zephyr Prime. Around the chamber, other delegates were experiencing similar reactions. The crystalline hive mind's harmonic frequencies became discordant. The nebulari's bioluminescence flickered uncertainly. Even the Ironborn Guard seemed to be experiencing some kind of system conflict. Captain McKinnon spoke, his voice calm and measured through the translator. I believe there's been a misunderstanding about my species. The words were polite, diplomatic even. But underneath them was something else entirely, a promise of consequences that defied logical analysis. Kethvar tried to respond, to maintain his dignity and authority, but found his vocal cords paralyzed. Across the chamber, the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy discovered that perhaps they didn't know as much about fear as they thought. Perhaps they were about to learn. The silence stretched across the council chamber like a taut wire ready to snap. Captain James McKinnon remained motionless in the observation deck, his gaze moving slowly from one delegate to another. Each time those dark eyes settled on a new target, that being seemed to shrink back imperceptibly. High General Voxthol was the first to break. His warrior's pride honed through 1,000 battles against the Void Reapers crumbled under that steady stare. The Crimson Legion's finest commander found himself taking an involuntary step backward, his battle-scarred carapace clicking against the floor. This is ridiculous, Voxthol snarled, but his voice carried none of its usual authority. We're allowing a single primitive to intimidate an entire assembly? Guard Captain Jektor, remove this human immediately. The Ironborn Guard Captain's photoreceptors flickered as he processed the command. His combat protocols indicated optimal tactical response. His threat assessment system showed a single unarmed target with no apparent weapons or technological advantages. Logic dictated immediate compliance, yet Jektor remained frozen in place. Guard Captain? Voxthol's voice climbed higher. I gave you a direct order. I cannot comply. Jektor's mechanical voice carried a note of confusion that should have been impossible for his kind. System conflict detected. Unable to process threat assessment. Dr. Silandra's tentacles writhed as she attempted to analyze the situation through her scientific instruments. This makes no sense, she muttered, her multiple eyes studying the readings. There's no pheromone release, no psychic emanations, no technological interference. The human isn't doing anything. But Captain McKinnon was doing something. He was remembering. Behind those eyes that had paralyzed a room full of galactic predators, memories played like old films. A burning outpost on Kepler 442b where he'd held the line against insurgent forces for 18 hours straight. The moment when his squad had been pinned down by superior firepower, and everyone had looked to him for a miracle. The day he'd walked into a terrorist compound knowing he might never walk out, because 23 civilians were counting on him. The aliens in this chamber thought they understood warfare. They had their energy weapons and their quantum shields and their perfectly logical battle algorithms, but they had never stood in a foxhole while artillery fell like rain, never felt the ground shake with the impact of incoming fire, never had to make the choice between their own life and the lives of their comrades. They had never learned that fear wasn't weakness, it was fuel. Captain McKinnon, Ambassador Kethvar finally managed to speak. though his harmonic undertones were completely absent. You requested to address the council. State your business. McKinnon's expression didn't change. You rejected our application for membership. Yes, the decision was unanimous. Your species lacks the necessary. You cited our military inadequacy as the primary reason. McKinnon's voice remained level, conversational even. You expressed concern about our emotional instability. Our fear. Cathvar felt his throat sacs contract again. That is correct. I see. McKinnon nodded slowly. Tell me, Ambassador, what do you know about the Battle of Thermopylae? The question seemed to come from nowhere. Several delegates exchanged confused glances while their universal translators struggled with the unfamiliar reference. I'm not familiar with 300 Spartan warriors. McKinnon continued, ignoring the interruption. Facing an army of hundreds of thousands. They knew they were going to die. They knew reinforcements weren't coming. They were afraid. His eyes found Voxthul across the chamber. But they stood anyway. The High General's carapace began to vibrate. An involuntary stress response his species hadn't exhibited in millennia. Normandy Beach, June 6, 1944, McKinnon continued, his gaze shifting to Dr. Silandra. 18-year-old boys jumping out of landing craft into machine gun fire. Scared out of their minds, vomiting from terror as they ran across open sand toward fortified positions. Silandra's tentacles had gone completely still. The Chosin Reservoir, the Siege of Stalingrad, the London Blitz, Iwo Jima. Every single human conflict you found so distasteful in our records. McKinnon's voice never rose above a conversational tone, but it seemed to fill the enormous chamber. Ordinary people facing impossible odds, terrified, outnumbered, outgunned. He paused, letting the silence stretch again. And yet, here we are. Still standing. Still fighting. Still expanding into a galaxy that told us we weren't ready. Trade Minister Kelnoth spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. What? What is your point, human? McKinnon smiled then, and somehow that expression was more unsettling than his steady stare had been. My point, Minister, is that you've misunderstood what fear means to us. You see it as a weakness, a flaw to be evolved beyond. He stepped closer to the barrier separating the observation deck from the main chamber. Every delegate unconsciously moved back. But fear isn't what makes us weak. Fear is what makes us dangerous. The lights in the chamber seemed to dim, though the ambient illumination hadn't actually changed. McKinnon continued speaking, each word falling into the silence like a stone into still water. When a human is afraid and has nowhere to run, when everything they love is threatened and all hope seems lost, something happens that your advanced civilizations have forgotten. We don't shut down. We don't surrender. We don't calculate odds and make rational decisions. His smile widened, showing teeth that suddenly seemed far too sharp for a supposedly herbivorous species. We become something that even we're afraid of. Guard Captain Jektor's optical sensors flickered rapidly as his threat assessment protocols finally found a classification for what they were detecting. It wasn't a category his designers had ever expected him to need. The human was prey that had evolved into a predator, but had never forgotten what it felt like to be hunted. And now it was hunting them. The emergency klaxons began wailing before anyone realized what was happening. Red warning lights bathed the council chamber in crimson as security protocols activated automatically. The chamber's AI had detected an imminent threat level that hadn't been triggered in over 2,000 years. But the threat wasn't an invasion fleet or a terrorist attack. It was a single human standing perfectly still, hands empty, expression calm. System lockdown initiated, announced the chamber's voice. All exits sealed. Emergency response teams en route. Ambassador Kethvar's four hands trembled as he tried to override the security protocols. Cancel emergency procedures. Stand down all responses. Unable to comply, the AI responded. Threat assessment indicates imminent danger to council members. Lockdown will remain in effect until threat is neutralized. McKinnon chuckled, a sound that somehow managed to be both amused and deeply unsettling. Your artificial intelligence is smarter than you are, Ambassador. It recognizes what you're all trying to ignore. And what exactly is that? Dr. Silandra demanded, though her voice lacked its usual scientific authority. That you're all prey animals playing at being predators. The words hit the assembly like a physical blow. Several delegates made involuntary sounds of distress. The crystalline hive mind's harmonic frequencies became discordant enough to cause minor structural vibrations in the chamber walls. McKinnon began to pace slowly along the observation deck barrier, his movement predatory and controlled. Each step seemed to echo despite the sound-dampening fields. "Let me tell you about the Void Reapers," he said conversationally. "Your greatest enemy. The terror of the Outer Rim. The unstoppable force that's been pushing into Coalition space for the last 50 years. High General Vox Thul's carapace rattled. "How do you know about... That information is classified at the highest levels." "We've been watching, General. Studying your conflicts. Learning from your failures," McKinnon's smile returned. "The Reapers have destroyed 17 colony worlds, devastated 4 fleet groups, and forced you to abandon entire star systems. Your response has been to fortify, retreat, and hope they get bored. Strategic withdrawal is sound military doctrine when facing superior forces," Voxthul protested, but the words sounded hollow even to him. "Is it?" McKinnon stopped pacing and turned to face the general directly. "Tell me, in all your strategic withdrawals, have you ever made the Reapers pay a price that made them think twice about attacking?" The silence was answer enough. "Humans have a saying," McKinnon continued. "The best defense is a good offense. When something threatens what we protect, we don't just defend. We hunt it down and kill it so completely that nothing else ever thinks about threatening us again." Trade Minister Kelnoth's translator struggled with the emotional undertones in the human's voice. "You're describing genocide." "No, Minister. I'm describing extinction. There's a difference." The distinction sent another wave of primitive terror through the assembly. These were civilized beings who fought according to established protocols, who limited casualties to preserve resources, who understood that even enemies had value in the galactic ecosystem. McKinnon was talking about something far more final. "You want to know why you fear us?" he asked. "It's because you recognize what we are, even if your conscious minds refuse to accept it. We're what your species were before you evolved beyond violence, before you learned to be reasonable, before you forgot that sometimes the only response to existential threat is existential response." He gestured toward the star field visible through the chamber's transparent walls. "Out there in the dark between stars, the Void Reapers are planning their next assault. They've learned that you're predictable, reasonable, that you'll always choose preservation over victory. And what would you do differently?" Ambassador Cathvar found himself asking, though he dreaded the answer. "Simple," McKinnon replied. "We'd follow them home." The casual way he said it made the words even more chilling. There was no anger in his voice, no passionate rhetoric. Just a flat, matter-of-fact statement that implied consequences so absolute they defied civilized comprehension. "You can't mean," Dr. Silandra began, "every ship, every base, every world that's ever served as a staging ground for attacks against innocent civilians. We'd track down every last one of them and make sure they never threatened anyone again. The resources required for such an operation would be astronomical," Trade Minister Kelnoth protested. "The loss of life would be worth it," McKinnon interrupted, "to ensure that no one else ever has to go through what your colonists experienced." He paused, letting that sink in before continuing. "But that's not even the scary part. The scary part is that we do it with primitive kinetic weapons and obsolete chemical explosives. We do it afraid, outnumbered, outgunned, and cut off from reinforcements. And we do it smiling because fear doesn't make us weak." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but somehow everyone in the chamber heard every word clearly. "Fear makes us creative." The chamber's emergency lighting flickered as if responding to his words. In that moment of strobing red illumination, McKinnon looked less like a diplomatic representative and more like something that had crawled up from humanity's violent past to remind the galaxy what apex predators actually looked like. "Your species conquered fear," he continued, "evolved beyond it, eliminated it as an inefficiency. And in doing so, you eliminated the thing that would have made you truly dangerous." Guard Captain Jektor's optical sensors suddenly flared bright blue as realization struck his artificial consciousness. "Analysis complete," he announced in a mechanical monotone. "Threat classification unknown. Recommended response, immediate evacuation of all personnel." "What?" Voxthul spun toward the Ironborn guard. "That's impossible. Your sensors must be malfunctioning." "Negative. All systems functioning within normal parameters. However, threat assessment algorithms lack adequate data to process this species' combat potential. Prediction models indicate unacceptable casualty rates in any engagement scenario. McKinnon nodded approvingly. Smart machine. It understands what you're all missing. You can't fight something you don't understand. And you don't understand us because we're not supposed to exist. He spread his arms wide, the gesture somehow both welcoming and threatening. We're what happens when prey evolves into predators but keeps the prey's memory of being hunted. We're what you get when you combine advanced intelligence with primitive survival instincts. We're the nightmare your species forgot how to have. The emergency klaxons continued their wailing cry, but now they sounded less like a warning and more like a funeral dirge for an age of civilized warfare that was about to end. The chamber's environmental systems began working overtime, as the assembled delegates experienced physiological responses their species hadn't felt in millennia. Stress hormones flooded systems that had evolved beyond such primitive reactions. Breathing patterns changed. Heart rates increased. Some beings were sweating substances they didn't know they could produce. McKinnon seemed to sense the change in the room's atmosphere. His smile faded, replaced by an expression of something almost like sympathy. "You're scared," he observed, not mockingly but with genuine understanding. "You're feeling something your ancestors knew but you've forgotten. The knowledge that there's something in the room with you that could end your existence, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." Ambassador Kethvar tried to regain control of the situation. "This is psychological warfare. You're trying to intimidate us with primitive displays of—" "No, Ambassador." McKinnon's interruption was gentle but absolute. "I'm not trying to intimidate you. I'm trying to educate you." He moved to the center of the observation deck, positioning himself where everyone could see him clearly. The barrier between him and the main chamber suddenly seemed inadequate, as if it were made of paper rather than military-grade transparent. "Aluminum. You rejected our membership application because you thought we were weak, unstable, controlled by our emotions rather than logic, McKinnon." His voice carried no accusation, just statement of fact. "You were right about one thing. We are controlled by our emotions. Fear, anger, love, hate, desperation. They drive us to do things that pure logic would never permit." Dr. Silandra's tentacles writhed as her scientific mind struggled to process what she was observing. Emotional decision-making leads to suboptimal outcomes. Every galactic civilization has proven this through evolutionary development. "Has it?" McKinnon turned his attention to her. "Tell me, Doctor, how many Void Reaper prisoners have your forces taken in 50 years of conflict?" "Prisoners? They don't—" "That is, the Reapers don't surrender. Their psychology doesn't permit—" "None," McKinnon stated flatly. 0 prisoners in 5 decades of war. And how many coalition worlds have you successfully retaken after Reaper occupation?" Silandra's tentacles went still. "The strategic difficulties of assault operations against fortified positions make such actions inadvisable when alternative approaches—" "None," McKinnon repeated. "You've never retaken a single world." He began walking again, his movement drawing every eye in the chamber. "You want to know what happens when humans get angry? When we're afraid and desperate and have nowhere left to run? Let me tell you about a place called Stalingrad." The holographic displays around the chamber flickered to life, showing archive footage that McKinnon had apparently prepared for this moment. Images of a city in ruins, of soldiers fighting in sewers and bombed-out buildings, of civilians taking up arms against invaders. The enemy had better equipment, better training, numerical superiority, air support, and complete tactical advantage. The city was surrounded. No retreat was possible. Any rational military commander would have surrendered to prevent unnecessary casualties. The images showed humans fighting with desperate fury, using improvised weapons, turning every building into a fortress, every street into a battlefield. Instead, we made the invaders pay for every meter of ground with blood and terror. We made them afraid to advance, afraid to sleep, afraid to turn corners. We turned a tactical defeat into a strategic nightmare that broke their will to fight. Trade Minister Kelnoth's voice was barely audible. The casualties must have been enormous. "Over 2 million dead," McKinnon confirmed without emotion. But the enemy lost something more valuable than soldiers. They lost their belief in their own invincibility. The holographic display shifted to show new images, Void Reaper incursions into coalition space. The systematic, methodical way they reduced defenses, the orderly retreat of coalition forces, the clinical efficiency of their occupations. "Your enemies aren't afraid of you," McKinnon observed. They know exactly what you'll do because you always do the same thing. Defend, delay, withdraw, fortify. Preserve your forces for the next engagement. Minimize casualties. Fight the war you want to fight instead of the war that needs to be fought. High General Voxthul's carapace was now vibrating so violently it created an audible hum. You're describing tactics that border on insanity. Yes, McKinnon agreed. And that's exactly why they work. He gestured toward the holographic displays. You fight logical wars against logical enemies using logical tactics. But the Void Reapers aren't logical. They're fanatics driven by beliefs you can't understand and motivated by goals you can't comprehend. You can't defeat fanaticism with reason. What are you suggesting? Ambassador Kethvar asked, though part of him didn't want to know the answer. I'm not suggesting anything, Ambassador. I'm making you an offer. The chamber fell silent except for the continued wailing of the emergency klaxons. McKinnon stood perfectly still, hands clasped behind his back, looking like a professor delivering a lecture rather than a representative of a supposedly primitive species. We don't want to join your coalition, he said finally. We want to replace it. The words hit the assembly like a physical blow. Several delegates made sounds of outrage, but none of them seemed able to find words adequate to respond. Your civilization has forgotten how to win, McKinnon continued. You've become so afraid of becoming monsters that you've forgotten how to fight them. You've evolved beyond the very instincts that would let you survive in a hostile galaxy. He smiled again, that expression that somehow contained both sympathy and predatory satisfaction. But we haven't. Guard Captain Jektor's optical sensors suddenly shifted to a deeper shade of blue. Alert! Long-range sensors detecting massive energy signatures approaching the station. Multiple vessels. Unknown configuration, ETA approximately 12 minutes. The blood drained from every face capable of changing color. Ambassador Kethvar's voice cracked as he spoke. Identification? Negative. Sensor signatures consistent with Void Reaper technology. Panic began to ripple through the chamber. Emergency protocols activated as delegates started moving toward escape routes that the security lockdown had sealed. The reality of their situation began to sink in. They were trapped in a station with no military escort, facing an enemy that had never left survivors. McKinnon remained perfectly calm. Remarkable timing, he observed. Almost like they knew exactly when and where to find the entire coalition leadership gathered in one place. The implications of his words struck home immediately. This wasn't a coincidence. Somehow, impossibly, this had been planned. You, whispered Dr. Silandra. You led them here. No, Doctor, McKinnon replied softly. You did. The moment you decided we weren't worthy of your protection, you made us very interested in finding new allies. The chamber erupted in chaos as the full magnitude of the betrayal became clear. But through it all, Captain McKinnon remained motionless, watching the panic with the patience of a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The real lesson was about to begin. The chaos in the council chamber reached fever pitch as delegates scrambled for exits that remained sealed by security protocols. Ambassador Kethvar's 4 hands flew across holographic interfaces, trying desperately to establish communication with the station's defense grid. Station command, respond immediately, he shouted into his communicator. We have incoming hostiles. Activate all defensive systems. Static answered him. Station AI, override emergency lockdown. Authorization Kethvar Alpha 77. More static. McKinnon watched the panic with detached interest like a scientist observing an experiment. They can't hear you, Ambassador. Your communication systems experienced a critical malfunction about 20 minutes ago. Impossible. Kethvar spun toward the human. Our systems are redundant, quantum encrypted, unhackable by any known technology. You're right, McKinnon agreed. They are unhackable by any known technology. The implication hung in the air like poison gas. Dr. Silandra's tentacles writhed in agitation as her scientific mind processed the revelation. Unknown technology. You're saying the humans have developed quantum intrusion capabilities that exceed our understanding? I'm saying you underestimated us, McKinnon replied simply. You saw primitive kinetic weapons and assumed primitive everything else. You never bothered to ask what we might have developed that you couldn't detect. High General Voxthul was frantically trying to reach his fleet commanders, his carapace clicking against the floor as he paced. Ghost Squadron, respond. Talon Wing, acknowledge. Anyone? Silence. Let me guess, McKinnon said conversationally. Your entire fleet just went dark simultaneously. Engines offline, weapons unresponsive, life support maintaining, but everything else dead in the water. The General's compound eyes bulged. How did you— Because that's what we do, General. When we can't win a fair fight, we make sure it isn't fair. The holographic displays around the chamber suddenly activated without authorization, showing external views of the Galactic Coalition station. In the distance, dark shapes were emerging from hyperspace, vessels unlike anything in the Coalition's databases. They moved with organic fluidity, their hull pattern seeming to shift and writhe as they approached. But between the station and the approaching Void Reaper fleet, something else was visible. Ships that were definitely human in origin, but larger and more advanced than anything in the Coalition's intelligence files. Sleek predatory shapes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Those aren't Void Reapers, Trade Minister Kelnoth whispered. No, McKinnon confirmed. Those are my people. Ambassador Kethvar felt his throat sacs constrict to the point where breathing became difficult. You're working with them. The Reapers? Working with them? McKinnon laughed, a sound that carried no humor whatsoever. Ambassador, we're going to exterminate them. Every last one. But first, we needed to understand why supposedly advanced civilizations kept losing to them. He gestured toward the main chamber where the delegates huddled together like frightened children. Now we understand. You've forgotten how to be apex predators. The external displays showed the human fleet positioning itself between the station and the approaching Reapers. For a moment, hope flickered in the chamber. Perhaps this was some kind of rescue operation. Then the shooting started, but the human ships weren't firing at the Void Reapers. They were systematically disabling the Coalition fleet vessels that surrounded the station, not destroying them, just removing their ability to fight or flee. You see, McKinnon explained as if discussing the weather, we needed to create the proper conditions for our experiment. Isolated location, complete Coalition leadership present, and a genuine Void Reaper threat to test our theories against. Dr. Silandra's voice was barely a whisper. Theories about what? About fear, McKinnon replied. About what happens when civilized beings are forced to confront their own mortality, without any hope of rational solution. The Void Reaper fleet had accelerated, apparently sensing easy prey. Their ships moved in perfect formation, weapons charging with the distinctive energy signatures that had terrorized the galaxy for decades. They think they're about to massacre another helpless Coalition facility, McKinnon observed. Standard operating procedure. Overwhelming force against minimal resistance. They've done this hundreds of times. The human fleet suddenly scattered, ships breaking formation and diving away from the approaching Reapers with apparent panic. To the Coalition delegates, it looked like humanity's forces were fleeing in terror. McKinnon smiled. But they've never faced prey that hunts back. The first Void Reaper vessel to enter optimal firing range simply disappeared. One moment it was there, weapons hot and ready to fire. The next moment there was only empty space and a fading energy signature. Then, the second ship vanished, then the third. The Reaper fleet's perfect formation began to waver as their ships started firing, wildly at targets they couldn't see, couldn't track, couldn't even detect. The human vessels had somehow become invisible to sensors, their positions marked only by the systematic elimination of the enemy fleet. Stealth technology, High General Voxthal breathed. But that's impossible. No material can hide from quantum resonance scanning. You're right, McKinnon agreed. No material can, but fear can. The statement made no sense until Dr. Silandra suddenly understood. Psychological warfare. You're not hiding your ships from their sensors. You're making their operators too afraid to trust what their sensors are telling them. Close, but not quite, McKinnon corrected. We're not making them afraid. We're using their own fear against them. He pointed to the external display where the Void Reaper fleet was disintegrating in real time. The Reapers aren't just fanatics, they're terrified fanatics. Their entire culture is built around the fear of something they call the Great Dark. They attack other civilizations not out of conquest, but out of desperation. The chamber fell silent except for the sounds of distant explosions visible through the transparent walls. The Void Reaper fleet, which had moments before seemed unstoppable, was being methodically destroyed by an enemy they couldn't even see. You turned their own terror into a weapon, Guard Captain Jektor observed, his mechanical voice carrying something that might have been admiration. We didn't have to turn anything, McKinnon replied. We just had to understand it. The Reapers have been running from something for so long they've forgotten what it's like to be the hunters instead of the hunted. They see ghosts in every shadow, enemies in every sensor reading. All we had to do was become their worst nightmare. The last Void Reaper vessel exploded in a brilliant flash that illuminated the entire station. In the aftermath, the human fleet began to reappear, their stealth systems powering down to reveal ships that looked more like works of art than instruments of war. "The experiment is complete," McKinnon announced. "We've proven that the Void Reapers can be defeated, not through superior technology or greater numbers, but by being more frightening than they are." He turned back to face the assembled delegates, all of whom were staring at him with expressions of shock, horror, and something approaching awe. "The question now is what happens next. You can continue believing that civilization means abandoning the tools that made you survivors in the first place. You can keep losing ground to enemies who understand that sometimes the only way to preserve what you love is to become what your enemies fear most." His smile returned, cold and predatory. "Or you can let us teach you how to be monsters again." The silence that followed McKinnon's offer stretched for what felt like an eternity. The assembled delegates stood frozen, their minds struggling to process what they had just witnessed. The most feared enemy in galactic history had been obliterated in minutes by a species they had dismissed as primitive just hours before. Ambassador Kethvar was the first to find his voice. Though it trembled with emotions his species had thought extinct. "You're asking us to become like you. I'm asking you to remember what you were before you decided that survival was less important than moral superiority," McKinnon replied. "Your ancestors were apex predators once. They fought and killed and died to protect what mattered to them. Somewhere along the way you decided that was beneath you." Dr. Silandra's tentacles writhed in agitation. "Civilization requires the abandonment of primitive instincts. Violence leads to chaos, destruction, the collapse of ordered society. Does it?" McKinnon gestured toward the debris field that had once been the Void Reaper fleet. "Or does the absence of violence lead to extinction when something truly dangerous shows up?" He moved closer to the barrier, and despite the transparent aluminum between them, every delegate took an involuntary step backward. "You've created a beautiful, peaceful, ordered civilization. You've eliminated want, suffering, conflict between member species. It's truly impressive," his expression hardened. "It's also defenseless against anything that doesn't share your values." High General Voxthul's carapace had stopped vibrating, but his voice carried a note of desperate confusion. "What you're describing, it's madness. Controlled madness perhaps, but madness nonetheless." "Yes," McKinnon agreed readily, "but it's effective madness. And when the alternative is extinction, effectiveness matters more than sanity." Trade Minister Kel Noth spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. "The casualties. The cost in lives, in resources, in souls. How do you live with the things you've had to do?" For the first time since entering the chamber, McKinnon's expression softened slightly. "The same way your ancestors did, Minister. We remember what we're fighting for. We carry the weight so others don't have to." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts before continuing. "Every human child who grows up safe because we eliminated a threat. Every civilian who never has to know what their leaders had to do to protect them. Every world that remains free because we were willing to become monsters so they could remain human. That's the burden of apex predators," he added quietly. "We don't get to be innocent. We don't get to have clean consciences. We get to ensure that innocence and clean consciences remain possible for those we protect." The chamber's emergency lighting finally stopped its incessant flashing, returning to normal illumination as the station's AI registered the elimination of the external threat. The sudden change from red to white light made the scene feel surreal, as if they were all waking up from a shared nightmare. "Your fleet," Guard Captain Jektor observed. "They're not leaving." Through the transparent walls, the human vessels could be seen maintaining position around the station. They weren't threatening, but their presence was unmistakably purposeful. "No," McKinnon confirmed. "They're not." Ambassador Kethvar felt his throat sacs contract again. "Are we prisoners?" "That depends," McKinnon replied. "Are you going to make a decision, or are you going to spend the next few hours debating philosophical implications while more Void Reaper fleets receive word that their advance force has been destroyed?" The implication hit home immediately. The destruction of an entire Reaper fleet wouldn't go unnoticed. Somewhere in the dark between stars, larger forces would be mobilizing. converging on this location to investigate what had happened to their scouts. "How long do we have?" Dr. Silandra asked. "Our intelligence suggests approximately 18 hours before the nearest Reaper battle group arrives," McKinnon answered. "Probably 3 full fleets, maybe more. Too many for us to handle alone, even with our advantages. But not too many for us to handle together," Voxthal said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn in his compound eyes. "Now you're thinking like a predator," McKinnon approved. "The question is whether you can make the transition in time to matter." Trade Minister Kelnoth was studying the human ships through the external displays. "Those vessels, they're not just military, are they? They're designed for something else." "Colony ships," McKinnon confirmed. "Generation ships, actually. Built to carry our entire civilization if necessary. We learned a long time ago that sometimes survival means being ready to walk away from everything you've built and start over somewhere else." "You're nomads," Kethavar breathed. "Your entire species is mobile." "We're survivors," McKinnon corrected. "When the Void Reapers inevitably trace our activities back to Earth, they'll find empty worlds and automated defenses designed to make them pay dearly for the privilege of bombing ruins." The scope of human strategic thinking was becoming clear, and it was staggering in its implications. Not just military victory, but civilizational survival through mobility and misdirection. "The offer stands," McKinnon said, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "We can teach you to fight. We can show you how to turn your greatest weakness, your unwillingness to embrace necessary violence, into a weapon against those who see it as an opportunity." He smiled, but this time it carried genuine warmth rather than predatory satisfaction. "Or you can maintain your principles and hope that the next enemy you face will be as reasonable as you are." The chamber fell silent as the delegates contemplated, a choice that would determine not just their own fates, but the future of galactic civilization itself. Outside, the stars watched with ancient indifference as the descendants of prey animals decided whether they still remembered how to hunt. Ambassador Kethvar looked around the chamber, seeing his fellow delegates with new eyes. These were the leaders of the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy, beings who had transcended the primitive impulses of their ancestors to build something beautiful and peaceful, and ultimately fragile. McKinnon was right. They had forgotten how to be monsters. The question was whether they could remember in time. 6 months later, the Galactic Council chamber looked very different. The polished obsidian walls now bore scars from weapons testing. Holographic displays showed real-time tactical data from 17 different battlefront. The delegates who had once positioned themselves according to ancient protocols of hierarchy now clustered around strategic planning tables, their movements sharp and purposeful. Ambassador Kethvar stood at the center of the chamber, but he was no longer the same being who had presided over humanity's rejection. His harmonic undertones carried new frequencies, darker, more aggressive tones that his species hadn't produced in millions of years. The change went deeper than voice. His eyes held something that would have terrified his former self. They held the patience of a hunter. "Status report," he commanded, his forearms manipulating tactical displays with practiced efficiency. High General Voxthal stepped forward, his scarred carapace now bearing fresh wounds from recent battles. The Centauri offensive was a complete success. 3 Void Reaper staging areas eliminated. Minimal coalition casualties. The enemy forces never had time to establish defensive positions. "They were expecting us to fortify and wait for them to attack," added Dr. Silandra, her tentacles dancing over data streams with newfound aggression. "Instead, we hit them while they were still deploying." The psychological impact was significant. McKinnon sat quietly in what had once been the observation deck, now converted into the Human Strategic Planning Center. He watched the transformed delegates with satisfaction, seeing the predators they had buried beneath millennia of civilization finally beginning to emerge. "The Tau Ceti Fleet Group reports similar results," Trade Minister Kelnoth continued. "The Reapers are beginning to show signs of systemic fear response. Their attack patterns are becoming increasingly erratic." "Excellent." Kethvar's voice carried harmonics that would have been impossible for his species 6 months ago. "What about the deep space reconnaissance?" Guard Captain Jektor's optical sensors glowed a steady blue as he accessed long-range sensor data. "Human stealth vessels have located what appears to be the primary Void Reaper staging area, a massive fortress system in the outer rim, heavily defended but accessible." McKinnon finally spoke, his voice carrying the same calm authority it had held during that first encounter. "You're ready." The words hung in the air like a benediction. Over the past months, the coalition forces had transformed from a defensive organization into something far more dangerous. They had learned to hunt. They had remembered what it meant to be predators. More importantly, they had learned to use their fear as fuel rather than allowing it to paralyze them. "The assault fleet is assembled," Voxthul reported. 17 species, 400 ships, and tactics that the Reapers have never encountered. But the fortress system will still be heavily defended. Casualties will be significant. "Acceptable," Kethvar replied without hesitation, and the casual way he said it would have horrified the peaceful diplomat he had once been. "The goal isn't to minimize our losses. The goal is to ensure their extinction." McKinnon stood and walked to the barrier that separated the human section from the main chamber. Over the months, that barrier had become more symbolic than functional. The distinction between human and coalition forces had blurred as the galaxy's civilized species rediscovered their savage heritage. "There's something else you need to understand before you launch this operation," he said. "The Void Reapers aren't just random raiders. Our intelligence has finally decoded their communications. They're refugees." The chamber fell silent. Dr. Silandra's tentacles stopped moving entirely. "Refugees from what?" "Something that destroyed their home galaxy," McKinnon replied. "Something that scared them so badly they've been running for thousands of years, destroying everything in their path because they're afraid of being followed." The implications hit the assembled delegates like a physical blow. If the Reapers were fleeing from something even worse, then we need to make sure we finish this before their pursuers arrive, Kethvar said, his voice carrying no trace of his former compassion. "Or before we become enough of a threat that they stop running and start fighting seriously." McKinnon smiled with genuine approval. The transformation was complete. The galaxy's most civilized species had remembered how to be monsters, and they were prepared to do whatever was necessary to survive. "Launch the fleet," Kethvar commanded. "All vessels, all species, maximum aggression. If something follows the Reapers into this galaxy, I want them to find nothing but debris and the knowledge that this space is claimed by apex predators." The chamber erupted into coordinated activity as the greatest military operation in galactic history began. Ships that had been designed for exploration and trade now carried weapons that would have been unthinkable 6 months before. Crews that had once prided themselves on their civilized restraint now prepared for total war. As the massive fleet departed for the outer rim, McKinnon remained in the empty chamber, watching the stars through the transparent walls. Captain James McKinnon, former soldier, had completed his mission. He had taken the galaxy's most advanced civilizations and reminded them what it meant to be truly dangerous. The irony wasn't lost on him. Humanity had been rejected for membership in the coalition because they were too primitive, too violent, too controlled by their emotions. Now those same qualities had become the template for galactic survival. A communication signal reached him from the departing fleet. Ambassador Kethavar's voice carried new harmonics that spoke of barely controlled savagery. "Captain McKinnon, final question before we commit to this course. Are you certain this is the only way?" McKinnon considered the question seriously before answering. "No, Ambassador. I'm certain it's the only way that works." The signal closed, leaving him alone with the stars and the knowledge that the galaxy would never be the same. The age of civilized warfare was over. The age of apex predators had begun, and somewhere in the dark between galaxies, something that had been hunting the Void Reapers for millennia was about to discover that prey sometimes evolved into something even more dangerous than their hunters. The galaxy held its breath and prepared to show the universe what happened when fear learned to fight back.